All right, I think it is officially 6 o'clock, so we'll get started with this month's How to Do Things in Oklahoma with Horses. So I'm Dr. Chris Heine with Oklahoma State University Extension Program, the equine specialist. And our June webinar episode, I'm going to be talking about just some of the highlights or some of the interesting information that I had an opportunity to see and hear colleagues talk about at our Equine Science Symposium. That was just last week in Asheville, North Carolina. So we'll give you a little bit of background and then we'll jump into some updates. So maybe I ought to start with what even is Equine Science Society. So essentially that is our collection of equine researchers in the US and really throughout the world. So that's kind of cool. I think we had individuals from at least 20 different countries perhaps at these meetings this past week. And at our meetings, we hear the latest research in nutrition and physiology and exercise science, latest techniques in teaching, our students and the general public, information on equine behavior, genetics, really a pretty exhaustive list. So it's a really fun meeting, again, for us to share the new information that we're trying to create to better the lives of our horses and our horse owners. So again, what I'm going to cover tonight are just the highlights. So my intention is always to keep our webinar series pretty short for our viewers. And again, what I have to focus on, these are only abstracts that get published to the meeting. So that means in layman's terms, it's a really short summary of someone's work. And it's really hard sometimes to get a full understanding of everything that they did with just the abstract. And then I only can really report on some of the sessions that I attended. So kind of the fun thing at our meetings that you may have 5 presentations occurring simultaneously. So everybody has to mark their proceedings and run around to each room to try to catch the research presentation that they're most interested in. Certainly if any of our viewers today have questions, please ask me. So you can ask questions directly through Zoom, or certainly can post questions through Facebook Live, or always you can email me at kheine@okstate.edu. So I'll get started with one of our keynote speakers at our meeting this year. It was Barbara Murphy, and she is based out of Ireland, but really did some fascinating research on the entire science of chronobiology of the equine. So chrono, think about time, chronology, and biology, obviously kind of the study of life. So how does time really interface with horses? And why would that actually be of concern for horse owners? So we certainly know that horses are under control of time and sunlight, so to speak. So as seasons change, horses will undergo bodily changes. And so really the chronobiology is kind of the study of how those interactions work. So how the horse perceives its environment through light or temperature, different things like that, and what it actually ends up doing on or having effects on the horse. So I'm not going to get deep into the science again, just trying to share some kind of fun highlights and some practical tips that might have come out of this research. So we'll talk a little bit about some differences that they might have seen in circadian rhythms. And so think about what happens within a 24-hour period. And then circannual rhythms, so that's more like seasonality, but again, that's going to be affected by light. And that's why we're going to talk about lighting. So Dr. Murphy, with some of her research, has shown, and others have as well, that there are natural rhythms that happen over a day, a 24-hour period in the horse and in other species as well. So this certainly is not unique to horses. But there are differences in the hormones of the animal, the temperature, metabolic processes that all seem to kind of make sense if we think about when a horse would normally be doing things as in its natural state and then perhaps what influence we have on what those horses' normal circadian rhythms are, and if we can influence that at all. So again, these are just some highlights of what she shared. So one of the interesting questions she posed, and this is probably related more to our racehorse industry, where our practice with our racehorses is they undergo all of their trainings and works in the morning, but sometimes they actually do their exercise or their competition, so to speak, in the afternoon or evening. And so kind of some interesting information relative to that. So if you think about it, for a horse, their activity is naturally going to be highest in the daytime. They're not really a nocturnal species. And so if you look at this little graph over here to the right, you can see the fluctuations in equine activity that would naturally occur with the peaks happening in the daylight hours. You can also see how a horse's rectal temperature will vary throughout a 24-hour period, and that's really important for horse owners to recognize that there are dips and peaks in a horse's body temperature. So especially when we're asking folks to monitor body temperature, especially after they've come back from competitions and we might be concerned with disease, and we always tell owners, hey, we want you to monitor temperature on those horses, understand that there may be some variation in there that you need to expect. But kind of the interesting part of what they found is that if horses were trained at a regular time of day, so let's say that you always ride your horse at 7 in the morning, you're really lucky and you ride your horse before you go to work, that your horse actually adapts the enzymes that are related to muscle and energy expenditure so that those start to sort of upregulate prior to when that animal or your horse would expect to be exercised. And this actually happens with people too. So kind of some fun relationships between equine research and humans. So the horse actually becomes adapted, its body becomes adapted to expect when that exercise is going to occur. And there's really out there peak ability to perform during that time period when the body expects to do activity. So that sort of leaves us the question, well, how often do we as owners and competitors, that if our horse is always being exercised at the same time of day, and the type of event it's involved in really does require some strenuous exercise, does that really match up with when the horse's body is adapted to that training regimen? So kind of just some fun stuff to think about. The other information that that Dr. Murphy presented was relative to type of light. And I'll confess, I haven't always really thought about type of light. My familiarity always been, with enough lumens for mares, like if we're wanting to get them to cycle earlier, we need to have it bright enough, or, really, can I see? I was always concerned with that. But we really didn't give a lot of thought to the UV spectrum of what natural light is compared to what the artificial lighting that our horses are subject to. So this is actually kind of interesting when we think about stable horses. So if you look up there to the left, that's the full UV spectrum of natural lighting, okay? So you may have even heard with some human information about how some of our computer screens might have more blue light to them, which may mimic what daylight actually is. So types of lights, if we look at incandescent lights or fluorescent lights, really don't have much of that blue wavelength that natural, good old-fashioned sunlight, which is what bodies are adapted to, are used to. So we kind of have to think about that a little bit when it comes to managing our horses. So why would that be important? Well, again, that blue light corresponds with day. So what the animal is perceiving, and us too, if we're using lighting that has a lot of that blue wavelength in it at night, that actually can interrupt sleep patterns. So again, kind of that recommendation of why we want our kids to shut off their iPhones at night, or why they don't recommend that you maybe have a TV or an electronic device in the bedroom, because that blue light at the wrong time of day can interrupt sleep patterns. The same thing is true for our horses. So on one side, we don't want to be keeping our horses up at night when they shouldn't be. And on the flip side, depending on what type of lighting we're using, for example, fluorescent, the horse may never be getting enough of that blue light that it naturally would get if it's stabled for the majority of the time. The other thing that they recommended was that if we do need to check on horses at night, so think about full watch or have lighting that the humans need to be able to see what's happening, to allow that animal to have their full amount of rest, it suggested that we actually use red light at night. And so that won't actually cause that wakefulness and interrupt that sleep cycle. So kind of some fun information to think about. Another kind of key piece to think about, again, relative to light, is night really is when our horses sort of sleep, and not that they don't sleep during the day, but a lot of that recovery from exercise or stress actually happens during night. So we want to make sure that the horses do have restful sleep. But think about at our larger horse shows, certainly this has been my experience, where we ride late into the night or early in the morning, that really does not correspond when that animal could be prepared for exercise. And what might that actually be doing to those horses' sleep cycles if they're under essentially 24-hour lighting when they go to a horse show, and at home they're not used to that. So just some practical tips to think about for our performance horses. So on the reproduction side of things, everybody's familiar with the idea that horses are seasonal breeders. That makes sense. So they are long day breeders, so that their 11-month gestation, when those foals would hit the ground, there would be plenty of forage available to help support mom's lactational needs, as well as help support foal growth. But with our horse management systems and things like that, our horses need to be sometimes foaled as early as possible in the year because of that universal birth weight. And so our earlier foals and our stronger foals are going to do a little bit better in that competitive environment. So research has shown that mares are actually going to be most responsive to increased lighting in December. So if you turn the lights on in November, that's not as effective as if you do it in December, or again, if you do it in January. So if we want to essentially get mares to come into regular seasonality with their cycle, we want to do that in December. So Dr. Murphy, and this is one of the devices, it's the Equiloom. So essentially they're little hoods that horses wear. And if you look at the horse's right eye there's a light that essentially exposes just one eye, and they found that was as effective as two eyes, to blue light. And if they put those lighting systems on mares, and especially pregnant mares, that we actually have foals that are born at heavier weights and shorter gestation. So really kind of interesting to think about that. Not only do we need mares to start cycling, which you can use that for an open mare, but our pregnant mares as well, there's some benefits to actually having this blue lighting to increase day length on these guys, again, resulting in some bigger, stronger foals with shorter gestation. So that can have a real impact sort of financially in the breeding industry. So then I just sort of created a collection of some research that I thought was kind of interesting, abstracts that I saw, the presentations, and thought would share. So we know that there have been a number of studies that have sort of put together starch and reactivity with horses. So horses that are getting calories the same amount, so it's not like we're feeding one horse more than another, but if same amount of calories, some of those calories coming from starch, whereas other calories are coming from fat, that the horses having calories coming from starch tend to be more reactive, so a little bit of increase in reactivity. So this was an interesting study from the University of Glasgow that they wanted to look into, well, why is that? So if starch increases reactivity, what is it that's doing it? Is it just the glucose in their blood, or is there something else going on a little bit deeper? So they looked at the microbiome, and I will confess I certainly could probably do 2 hours of a presentation today talking about equine microbiome. This is a really, really hot topic in the equine industry as well as humans across the board. Everybody is talking about the microbiome these days. And it's way more than, I mean, we always know horses are hang-up fermenter, so bacteria and microflora is really important for them. But we're really realizing that the microbiome, or essentially think of all the bacteria that live in and on you, can cause a lot of effects. So there's some links on the human side with the gut bugs that you have between obesity, how you feel, so your behavior, so depression, anxiety can be affected by bacteria. So again, there must have been, I tried to count them all up, at least 30 or more presentations that were related to the microbiome, microflora in the horse at this meeting. But let's get back to starch and reactivity. So these researchers did find that starch did change the horse's behavior. So with their feeding regimen, they had horses that were a little bit higher anxiety. And of course, they found alterations in the microbiome in the horse's gut, which makes sense because if they're on two different diets, those diets will support different types of bacteria. But what they did that went a step further is look at how the microbiome mapped to the behavior of the horse. And then they looked deeper into tissues and found that there were actual changes in the dopamine and serotonin receptors in the horse's brain when they were on these two different diets. So kind of a really interesting study trying to piece out what exactly is it that is causing these differences in behavior in horses. And certainly as those researchers put it, well, you know, perhaps in your industry, a little reactivity is not a bad thing. So that might be okay in some situations where for others we might want to steer away from that. But I think there's going to be a lot more coming out on microbiome and how that may influence horse behavior, obesity, etc., going forward. So just share a few other little things again on the microbiome, and there were a lot of presentations on this. I thought this one is rather interesting. So similar to some of the studies we've seen in humans where we have changes in microflora that are linked to adiposity, or essentially how lean or fat a human is. So we had researchers that were looking at that in horses. So we all know there are horses that are described as hard keepers and easy keepers. So they questioned, well, maybe it's actually the gut bugs that are causing that difference. So who knows? So they did actually find some differences in the microbiome in the hard keepers. So they had sort of moderate horses that always were kind of rolling around those 5 or 6 body condition scores. They had obese horses, and then they had those horses that were identified as thin. The moderate and higher body condition horses really weren't different, but the hard keepers, or those ones that just don't seem to keep weight on, they did find there were differences in their gut bacteria. Whether that's related to they can't metabolize energy as well, or who knows, maybe it's the microbiome causing more anxiety in these horses. I mean, that's what's so interesting about this field of research. We're just really, really getting started in this. Okay, moving on. So then, again, like I said, there's all kinds of studies out there about how our management practices affect microbiome. There were studies on how we wean foals, on transport, exercise, diet, behavior, so many things that were related to looking at what's going on in the gut. But I thought this was kind of an interesting study. So I'll confess, actually, my graduate student, Brittany Kirkland, attended this seminar, and then she told me a little bit about it. But this was a study where researchers did a meta-analysis looking at probiotic effectiveness. So we all know there's lots of probiotics on the market, but certainly I know as an extension specialist and a consumer, we always want to know, well, does this actually work or not? So these researchers from Florida went about trying to look, does it actually work? So if they looked at all of the different studies from multiple researchers, pulling all that data together, which is essentially what a meta-analysis is. So you're not doing the data, but you're collating all the information from multiple sources and taking into account all the variations in methodology. when they pooled all of that together, they actually didn't find that probiotics had any advantage over control in altering, and in this case, they were looking at the incidence of diarrhea. So I think part of that is we're so early into really understanding what's going on in the gut of the horse. Our technology is advancing now so much we're able to look at DNA and pull samples from different parts of the GI tract instead of just fecal output. So again, interesting area of study, and there'll be much more coming out looking at bacteria and how it affects the health of the horse. So again, just kind of pointing out some studies that I attended that I thought were kind of interesting. So we're kind of heading back to starch. So this was just the kind of why I pointed this study out. Researchers in this area at Kansas State, they had cecally cannulated horses. So that means they essentially have the ability to peek into the horse's cecum and pull out samples. So not literally peeking, but the cannula essentially allows access into the cecum of the horse so that you can feed the horse something and then pull samples out of the cecum and see what happened after you fed them. So what they were doing is feeding horses increasing amount of starch and then looking to see what happened over hours after feeding, and then they kept increasing the horses on their starch diets. So what they found is you definitely start to see effects on the cecal microbiota once we hit over 2 grams per kilogram of body weight of starch per meal. So trying to put that into a little bit more plain speak. So if I had an 1,100 pound horse, essentially if they consumed more than 2.2 pounds of starch, so again, that's starch, not just concentrate, that started to change the microbiota and alter the pH of the horse's cecum as well. That might be a little bit of a chicken and the egg, which one comes first. But practically speaking, they were using corn for their study. So anytime it went over 3 pounds, then you start seeing some stuff going on within the horse's tract. Well, in this study, they kept increasing the amount of starch the horses would get. And what they found, which is kind of cool, a lot of the horses didn't make it through this study. Now, so I want to be clear here. They were pulled off. They didn't die. So the horses started to have colic or went off feed, et cetera, so they had to pull them off the study. But some horses could tolerate very high levels of starch. So it seemed to be very individual, which is maybe why some horses can break into the feed bin and be like, yep, that was great. And then some horses, too much starch, you know, here comes the vet bills. So very individualistic between the horses. But what I thought was interesting, the horses that could tolerate those higher starch levels somehow seemed to have a capacity within their GI tract that they really maintained a more stable pH than the other horses, where the pH started to crash on them, and then they simply were not able to continue on the study. So again, we don't really know why some horses would be able to tolerate that, but again, just kind of a fun area of research. And in general, again, why we want to avoid high amounts of concentrate at any one time for our horses. So keep those feed rooms locked. So the other kind of starch paper that I thought was interesting actually compared, and it wasn't really a starch paper, but compared the feeds between US feeds and horses that are housed in Europe. So kind of a cool study here. So it was a comparison between the feeds that folks brought over with them for the equestrian games, so the World Equestrian Games. So researchers had sampled feed from 2010, and then they did it again in 2018. So these were horses that were essentially elite athletes coming over to the US to compete, and of course they brought their feed with them. If you have an elite athlete, you don't just say, hey, let's try something new and see what happens. So they brought over their feeds to keep the horses on their same diet. So researchers, and this is Dr. Joe Pagan from Kentucky Equine Research, just compared to see, well, are they changing? Is there anything different going on now in how the Europeans feed their horses compared to us? So I thought this was really interesting. So when you looked at the sport horse feeds that they were using on these elite athletes, obviously if they're flying them over here to compete in World Equestrian Games, they're pretty special horses. Their sport horse feeds were relatively low in fat, and we certainly have undergone a bit of a revolution in our performance horse feeds that are usually much higher in fat. Their feeds were much higher in starch and non-structural carbohydrates than in our typical horse feeds. So really a very different way of feeding them. But again, these were elite horses, so the amount of exercise they were undertaking, certainly they were able to do that. Dr. Pagan also talked about a lot of times the Europeans will add hay chaff, so essentially chopped hay into their feed. So it may be a difference in how they're feeding their horses, but didn't appear that our European friends were as afraid of feeding high starch feeds to their performance horses as we see in the US. So then this was some papers from Dr. Carrie Hammer from, Carrie Hammer, I say that every time, it's Carrie Williams, I'll get this right one of these days, that she looked at rotational grazing. So we all know that rotational grazing is really going to be the best for our horses, for our pasture, maybe for our budgets, we don't know, but most studies have been relatively short term. So this was kind of interesting. Dr. Williams actually did a 27-month project. So that's some dedication to follow the same pastures and do continual sampling for 27 months on a research project. So I think that's why this paper was really kind of separated itself out. So in New Jersey, they used continuous versus rotational grazing. They had the same stocking density between the continuous and the rotational grazed pastures. And essentially the continuous grazed horses, they always could be on their pasture. They were never held off. And the rotational grazed horses, they had a sacrifice lot. And if the grass was not tall enough in the rotational grazing pastures, they were provided hay. And then obviously the continuous grazed horses would be supplemented if there wasn't enough forage out there either. So as you can imagine, and I'm sure you all know, rotational grazing does create better pastures. So they had higher sward height, was essentially the height of the grasses. Overall, more mass was growing in these rotational grazed pastures over those 27 months. They had much more grass. There wasn't the bare spots in rotational grazing. Overall, the pastures look much, much healthier in the rotational grazing. But the interesting thing is they calculated all the costs in hay and pasture maintenance between continuous grazing and rotational grazing, and there wasn't an additional cost to rotational grazing, at least in their system. So I do have to say, again, that was in New Jersey, but really interesting that the hay costs ended up being equivalent between no care of the pasture and using rotational grazing. And with personal conversations with Dr. Williams, she had even indicated, I think on their final year, their continuous grazed pastures took until after they had removed the horses. So this was really interesting. After they had removed the horses and they were sort of letting the pastures regrow, see what would happen, the continuous grazed pasture did not reach the same height as the rotational grazed until like October. So really amazing how much a difference just use that planned rotational grazing can make on pasture health and sustainability and all those things we're really interested in with our horses. So I thought I'd be remiss not to mention this paper. So this was a paper from Michigan State University. So Alyssa Logan was our primary researcher on this study. So I actually am going to borrow some of Alyssa's slides. So I happen to be on Alyssa's master's committee. So I had some insider information on this, which did a great job presenting her data. But she was looking at the effect of exercise in young animals and asking essentially, well, how much exercise does a young animal need in order to increase skeletal strength? So I'll just present some of Alyssa's data here. So in this study, what they actually did is they had confined calves. So they used calves, and then they sprinted the calves 1 day a week, 3 days a week, or 5 days a week. And what they found Even sprinting those calves only 1 day a week compared to no exercise created more width to the dorsal part of their little cannon bones. So essentially that's the front part of that bone. And so that's the part when we think about horses with buck shins and dorsal metacarpal disease, that's always the area of most injury. So a more robust dorsal cortex, a cortical width, would then indicate that it's a stronger bone. And the fun thing with this project, so they actually did fracture force. So the calves were sacrificed in this study at the end of the study. But this is really interesting if you look at the fracture force, or how much force essentially it takes to break those bones, that only that 1 day a week really increased skeletal strength up to 20% in those exercise calves. So really, really cool study. Really excited to be part of that. So in general, what does that mean practically speaking? We really don't recommend confining young animals. So when animals are young, that's when their skeleton is undergoing the most rapid growth, and those bones are really starting to take shape for the future. So it's always really key that we create strong bones when animals are young. So confining them is like the worst thing we could do. It's like exposing them to no gravity or being like in bed rest. So we want to make sure that those young animals are up and moving when they're young. But the really, really interesting part of this is it doesn't take that much sprinting to really be helpful. So we want to make sure we give our young animals opportunities to move around. If sprinting exercise, and this doesn't mean that we have to go long or forced very much, but they really will do much better if we allow them some little bit more robust exercise as they're growing. Then just a few more to kind of round out really a diverse array of topics. There were some folks that presented a workshop on helping owners and students understand euthanasia, hospice care, and kind of making quality of life decisions. So they were talking about using some tools which are adapted from companion animal medicine that may help owners make those decisions. So looking at, how much pain does the animal experience? Are they eating? Are they happy? Do they have good days? And sort of creating a score for owners to use that then gives you a little bit more of an objective tool, so to speak, on when it may be time to actually euthanize that animal. And they also really emphasized the need for grief counseling. So many horses, and we've talked about this before, spend so many years with their owners. If you've had that horse 20, 30 years, that loss of that individual may be very hard. And again, those around you may not really understand that. And so kind of just bringing that to the forefront, that need for grief counseling with equine owners is a real thing, and to seek that out. So last study that I have, sorry, no fun dynamics in this one. Actually, Dr. Hillary Clayton did this workshop for us, or it was a keynote speaker. And she has spent her career looking at forces on the horse and biomechanics with riders, all sorts of different influences on how the animal actually moves. But she presented some interesting information on how small circles can actually create artificial lameness in horses, just because horses naturally lean in. So surprise, surprise, horses don't like to hold themselves up perfectly straight when they're circling. They naturally lean to the inside. And when they do so, they are putting more force on the outside limb. And because this is just a naturally occurring thing, it actually makes the horse sometimes appear to be lame, even when they may not be. So we certainly want owners to pay attention to lameness in horses, but if you're doing a lameness evaluation on really small circles, you may be creating some artificial evidence of lameness there. So just kind of some interesting practical tips going forward. So with that, these are my colleagues in extension horses, so a group of equine specialists across the country that work together to try to create exceptional online programming for adult and youth. So a shout out to all my colleagues. Was a great meeting, learned a lot, lots of new ideas going forward. So at this time, if anybody has any questions, I'm going to check in with Facebook Live. Be happy to ask questions. Anybody that's out there. And I'll stay on for a little bit. And again, I'll post this later on. So a few moments here if anybody wants to ask a question. And I'll stay on for a little bit. Gotta make sure I turn the sound down. And certainly at this time, guys, or at any time, if there are certain topics that you would want to hear more about or areas of equine research that you find interesting and want to dig a little bit deeper, I'd be more than happy to share some of that information in the